time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning Tom Carpenter. Tom Carpenter is Executive Director at the Hanford Challenge. Prior to his current position, he was the Director of the Nuclear Oversight Campaign for the Government Accountability Project. He also helped establish and is a board member of the Hanford Concerns Council and its predecessor, the Hanford Joint Council, and was a former member of the Hanford Advisory Board. Tom, thank you very much for coming back in and spending time with us again this morning.
Well, thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
So start out, tell us, for those that are unfamiliar, what is the Hanford Challenge?
Well, the Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to oversee the cleanup at the nation's most contaminated nuclear facility called the Hanford site, which is located here in Washington State, eastern part of the state. And it was built in World War II to make plutonium used in our nuclear arsenal. And so that mission is over. They're not making plutonium anymore, but the hangover, if you will, from making that plutonium is this very large area of contamination where they have tanks of nuclear waste that are sitting there needing remediation. There's a lot of contaminated groundwater. It's really, it's just, if you talk about a Superfund site, this is like the granddaddy of Superfund sites. And it's going to take decades to clean this up, maybe longer. And it's costing the taxpayer about $2 billion a year and will for the next several decades in order to get a handle on containing that nuclear mess. So our job is to help nuclear whistleblowers there, to inform the public, educate the public about what's happening, to work with Congress, to on occasion bring lawsuits on environmental matters or to protect workers. And so that's our mission.
All right, so we last talked to you in February of this year, and since then there have been numerous developments out at the Hanford Reservation. One of the issues that you have been at the forefront of regarding Hanford is injured tank farm workers. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure. In any industry, the workers are the front line of the people who are going to get exposed, and it's true at the Hanford site. So at Hanford, there are these very large inventories of nuclear waste in these underground tanks, and each tank is 1 million gallons, up to 1 million gallons, and it's radioactive material mixed with chemicals, and it's very reactive. It's very dynamic, and so they burp gases and vapors. Workers on top of the ground that are doing work to transfer waste or to simply take the temperature of the tank and that kind of thing often inhale these vapors. And over the years, many people have become exposed and made sick and ill from these exposures. So in 2014, after a good 12 years of study, a new round of exposures happened, and at that point, a lot of the observers, like Hanford Challenge, unions at the site, and even the Attorney General's office for the state of Washington, decided that this time there needed to be a permanent and lasting fix to the vapor exposures, because Hanford simply was not doing what was necessary to protect these workers. So after some 70 or so workers, 80 workers got exposed in 2014, we filed, and by we, I mean Hanford Challenge, the Pipefitters Union out there, Local 598, and the Washington Attorney General's office filed a notice of intent to file a lawsuit, which gave them 3 months to get their act together. A report came out that said all the things that were wrong there and how they weren't protecting workers and how they were doing everything wrong. Unfortunately, this was like the 20th such report. So, we weren't at all secure in the knowledge that they would go forth and implement the recommendations. So that's why we filed the notice. And we gave them almost a year to start implementing these recommendations. And in that time frame, a whole bunch of more people got exposed. So we did file a lawsuit in September of 2015. And since that time, there have been more exposures, but this past summer, most of those exposures happened in April and May and June when they conducted a transfer. So at that point, we've filed a motion for preliminary injunction saying we want the relief now, we want the protections now. And that was in July. And the response to that from the company and the DOE was to put all the workers finally on supplied air respiratory protection. And the exposures have largely gone away since then. And the unions also issued a stop work. So since that time, people have been pretty protected. So I think, we're maybe hoping to wind down this lawsuit. We'll sustain it as long as we need to, because we don't have permanent protections yet. They're not nailed down, so we need an enforceable agreement. So that's kind of where things are. The exposures have largely gone away because of the use of supplied air, which is what we've always been pushing for. But in the end, there needs to be an engineered control where these vapors don't enter the breathing air environment of the workers at all, right? They filter these vapors or they blow them away from where the workers are working, one or the other. But right now, their only choice is respiratory protection for supplied air. It's very dangerous stuff.
It appears the resistance from DOE and its contractors to having supplied air as a regular feature for the workers is that it slows down the whole process. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what they say. And it doesn't really add up. They've done some self-serving studies on it, but what they don't do is make it easier to use the supplied air. So, for instance, they're making workers out there carry these 35-pound tanks on their backs, and you do that for a couple hours, and you got to take a break, and it's hot and everything else. Well, modern science has come up with something called an airline, where you have a tank and all you're carrying around is a line, kind of like a scuba diver. And they used to do that at Hanford, but the companies refused to implement that. So that's NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, just came in 6 weeks ago and say, why aren't you doing this? Well, this has been said for years. They just are very intransigent to change. They're in denial about the health effects of these vapors, despite all the people who have been seriously ill and permanently ill from exposure. Management just does not want to do it, does not care about their workers. And, that's got to change. And if it takes a lawsuit to make them change, we'll do that. But yes, they've been pulling the economic card on it. And it's costing them so much more to not deal with the issue. So that's really what the funny part about the whole thing is if they had implemented these protections 12 years, 15 years ago, like they should have when they first got notice of this stuff, then we wouldn't be in the spot we're in today.
Can you briefly touch on some of the physical manifestations of the exposures that the workers are having to deal with now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you breathe in toxic vapors like this, number one is there are hundreds and hundreds of chemicals that are known to be toxic. They mix together, having unknown health effects when they mix together. People are suffering lung disease, industrial asthma, something called reactive airways dysfunction syndrome, or RADS. They have problems breathing for the rest of their lives. They can't go out into the community because something like a deodorant or a dry erase marker could cause them to go into kind of a toxic shock. So their lives change very dramatically. So that's one. Another is some of these chemicals attack the nervous system, and people, get toxic encephalopathy, which can be fatal. And there have been some people who have died from that. Other people are still suffering the effects of it, which might include dementia, what's called neuropathies, where you lose control of part of your body, including maybe your speech patterns and that kind of thing. So these have been documented, diagnosed by doctors. People have gotten compensation through the worker comp system and other systems. And yet Hanford continues to, kind of maintain that the vapors are not dangerous and that no one's been hurt. And they take this position in federal court recently, and the judge said, what are you talking about? The record is replete with examples of that. So I think we're finally on a track where, I think we're going to get some remedies and some protections into the future, because there's a lot of people going to be working around this waste for the next 40 years as they empty these tanks, as they need to do, and process this waste in the waste treatment plant, hopefully, and vitrify it so that it's no longer as much of a danger.
Well, talk about the waste treatment plant. They've been working on that for decades now, and didn't the price tag just go up on it?
Yeah. So waste treatment plant is a large facility next to the Tang farms that they started. The latest iteration they started building in 2000, and Bechtel, National, and URS, which is now AECOM, we're partners in building this large facility. And its purpose is to take tank waste and turn it into glass. And it's a good idea. It's happened at other facilities around the world, but at Hanford, for some reason, they're having a lot of troubles making that a reality. So the facility was supposed to open in 2007. And then that changed to 2009, and then 2011. And, in 2010, some whistleblowers came forward, top management engineers and scientists, and said this facility the design is dangerous, the construction is fraudulent, you haven't used the correct parts that have been nuclear certified, and they were dismissed. They were fired. They were laughed at. They were ostracized in their own communities and unemployable after they spoke out. And yet, because of a massive amount of attention that we helped bring to this, and the national media and in Congress, we testified in Congress several times, et cetera, they were proven right. They were validated. And so that was in 2016, they're now having to redesign the facility. They've got a fast track, so-called, to start hopefully vitrifying low activity waste. The high activity waste portions are more difficult and more of a challenge. That's the high gamma emitting waste. But the fact is that, some $19-20 billion have been spent on this one facility, this issue actually of vitrifying waste, 19 billion, yet not one drop of high-level waste has been processed. And we're years and years away from it. So the last date that we heard for opening this site was 2036. For full operations of the waste treatment plant. Now they're hoping to get the low activity waste facility up and going sooner than that. But, and they say 2022, but that date also slips and the GAO says you'll never make it. So last week, right before Christmas, Hanford and the DOE had put out a paper saying the cost of the facility was going to rise from $13.6 billion to $16.8 billion, a $4.5 billion increase. Now, the original projected cost was $4.3 billion. So it's gone up quite a bit. I don't believe the $16.8 billion. I think it's probably double that before we finally get to where it needs to go. And frankly, I don't care. Whatever it takes to make this a safe and effective facility. We spent about $7 trillion to make nuclear weapons. Hanford was a big part of that. It was the factory that made that plutonium. And whatever it takes to protect current and future generations, we got to do that. So that's where we are. And if we're not going to make the same mistakes going forward, we do need a change in approach from the government and from the contractors to make sure that they don't make the same mistakes over and over again. But I'm afraid that's the track we're on right now, is essentially a fraud treadmill. And having said that, the companies involved in this facility just paid $125 million to settle a fraud suit brought by whistleblowers on behalf of the government. And they paid this money to the government. They did not admit guilt. They say they didn't do anything wrong, but here's $125 million. The allegations in that lawsuit were that they used the wrong parts, that they used government money for lobbying Congress, which is a big no-no, that the design was fraudulent and they knew it, and they went ahead anyway and they enriched themselves, et cetera, et cetera. Again, they didn't admit liability, but they did pay out the money. So we'll see what happens next. They're still working at that site, right? So Bechtel and AECOM still have the job.
Wasn't one of the issues that was brought out by the whistleblowers was that the proposed design at that time would potentially have hydrogen explosions within it and/or major nuclear releases? Yes.
The problem with the plan, so many problems, it would take me several hours to kind of detail them all. But some of the big ones were, if you've got these enclosed facilities and tanks, it's all in what's called a black cell, which there's no doors or windows or lights in there. So all the processes are happening in this very large room, the size of a football field, as high, right? So it's lots of tanks and pipes and whatnot. The problem was, once you remove the waste from the tanks and pump it into these tanks, you add acid to dissolve that waste so you can start processing it, filtering it out. The mixing in these tanks was insufficient. So heavy particles of plutonium could fall to the floor of that tank, and that causes a risk of what's called nuclear criticality. When plutonium amasses in sufficient quantity, it can go nuclear, basically. And the other is that the intense amount of alpha particle bombardment of water can actually break apart the water molecule, which, as we know from our high school science, is hydrogen and oxygen. So now you've got free hydrogen gas and oxygen floating around in the headspace of the tank. The tank was not designed to handle that. So there's no way to vent that hydrogen out of there. We reach a certain point of concentrations of hydrogen and you have oxygen in there, it will catch fire or it will explode. It is a given. It's very dangerous stuff. Think the Hindenburg, right? It doesn't take a whole lot to set it off. So the smart guys that they had hired to oversee this facility and the design said, your mixing isn't going to make it, right? You're going to have this problem. And the response to that was to walk them out the door and get rid of them. Walt Tamasitis settled his wrongful discharge suit for $4.2 million, right? And also he's one of the people that brought this other False Claims Act lawsuit charging these companies with committing fraud. But yeah, there were some very hefty safety issues putting the Northwest at risk. So we owe these people a great debt of gratitude, in my opinion, for bringing out these problems, even though they suffered with their career to bring it out.
Any chance of those people going back to work on this facility to keep an eye on what is happening from here on out?
That would be such a wonderful development if you got a company in there that actually believed in hearing problems and fixing them in a timely manner. What a message that would send to the workforce that we have a change now. We're welcoming people to raise questions, but it's not going to happen with this administration or the next administration. It's not going to happen with these companies. They've declared themselves enemies of dissent, enemies of people bringing forth problems, and they will punish and retaliate against anybody who brings forth reports because it gets in the way of their profits. And they talk a good game and say, no, we're making progress, but actually the studies don't support that. There's a high level of fear at the facilities. It's very punitive companies that run these facilities, and people have a great deal of a chilling effect of not willing to be the person that brings out the problem, because they saw what happened to Walt Tamasitis and Donna Bushy and Gary Brunson and some of the other folks out there. Is if you can get rid of your top managers like that, drawing in some pretty big salaries, how am I going to fare? A pipe fitter, right? Or a mid-level manager? I don't have a chance, right? So people that want to keep their high-paying jobs, they're going to keep their mouth shut.
Doesn't, as a member of the tri-party agreement, doesn't Washington State have any leverage for getting decent people in at these facilities for, if nothing else, oversight jobs?
Yeah, the Department of Ecology does have oversight. They have some staff committed to the waste treatment plant, and in the end, that plant has to be licensed by the state of Washington. They have to get a permit to operate under RCRA, which is the Toxic Hazardous Waste Law. So they can't regulate the radioactive part, but they can the chemical part. And really, it's a big chemical facility, so they're in good shape. But they don't involve themselves in employee retaliation and et cetera. And they're not very transparent with us or anyone else about what's happening. So the whole scene out there is very insular. They consider themselves part of the team, the Hanford team. So you go to a public meeting, those guys all sit together and chat, right? They're neighbors. Their kids go to school, the same schools. They go to the same parties, and so and their staffs interchange a lot, right? So someone who works at Department of Ecology, the state of Washington, suddenly is working at Bechtel or one of these other companies. And for many in the government, that's the retirement, pathway, is to go to work for one of these companies. But they're not going to get hired if they weren't nice to these companies. So, it's called regulatory capture. And that's what's going on at Hanford. And it's a problem that needs to be tackled.
All right. Well, you touched on it earlier. Obviously, we have a new administration coming in here shortly. And what are you anticipating from some of the folks who are going to be in charge of both Department of Energy and as well as our Washington State reps?
Well, I've long said that the Department of Energy is the problem at the Hanford site. Contractors come and go, and the results of dysfunction and mismanagement and lack of oversight leading to fraudulent behaviors, et cetera, continue. It's got a terrible record for environmental remediation at Hanford, just awful. Lots and lots of waste of money, et cetera. So part of me hopes that there will be big changes at the Department of Energy. If Trump came in and abolished the whole department, it probably wouldn't break my heart. It would be an opportunity for something new. I don't think he's going to do that, though. I think, mostly what the Department of Energy does is maintain our nuclear arsenal, and that's 80% of its budget. 70 to 80%. Hanford is a part of that. Trump has announced Rick Perry, a guy who has a degree in animal husbandry, was the governor of Texas, couldn't even remember the name of the Department of Energy as, the agency he wanted to abolish. What's he know about it? Well, he comes from a state, that has a lot of oil. So it's, my guess is that they will cut the budgets for cleanup at Hanford. that there will be less transparency, that a lot of tools that we rely upon, for instance, the Hanford Advisory Board, et cetera, to get information may go away. So, there's, maybe something good will happen unexpectedly, but pretty much I'm not very optimistic.
All right. What about Dan Newhouse, since he's going to be in charge of funding for cleanup?
Well, we'll see where he gets. Dan Newhouse is a moderate Republican. He was in the Gregoire administration, and obviously believes in the Hanford cleanup, I think, and he's going to fight for it. Well, what kind of power or influence he's going to have with the Trump administration? I mean, look at the OMB director that they're proposing to bring in as a big budget hawk, right? So he wants to cut. So where will Washington State delegation get on this? I don't know, but I hope that he's able to keep Hanford funding in place, because we need the money to be able to continue the cleanup, even though it's limping along. If you cut it far enough, then you are risking disasters, right? There are areas at the Hanford site that need caretaking. And if you don't caretake these highly dangerous inventories, then there's going to be a bad situation one day. Explosions, releases of radiation, et cetera. So you've got to spend the money to keep the community safe.
All right. Well, with that, we're just about out of time. We're talking with Tom Carpenter. He's executive director of the Hanford Challenge. How do people find out more about your work at the Hanford Challenge?
Well, the easiest way is to go to our website, which is our name, hanfordchallenge.org. And on there, you can find the latest news and, find out more about the lawsuits and the progress that's been made, et cetera. And all you listeners out there, please donate to KEXP and Hanford Challenge. This is the time to do it. Your donations are tax deductible, and we need to work together as a community to solve these kind of problems.
All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Okay, thank you.